Cutler YMX uses the Netrodyne two-way camera system in all of our power units. The Netrodyne cameras have more than once exonerated a driver who was perceived to be at fault, as well as saved our Cutler YMX from paying damages related to an accident. We are already seeing, just in 1 year of Netrodyne, the impact of better safety scores and fewer damages and incidents in our insurance rates.
Welcome to this week's Freightonomics. Zach Strickland, Tony Mulvey here. Gonna talk a lot today about, I think, what everybody's top of mind is in the supply chain space, transportation, domestic specifically, the ILA strike. We're gonna break down some of that stuff. We got some CPI readings to talk about, and then we had a hurricane.
We did.
That
it affected oil and gas to some degree, but not really.
Yeah, so we'll dive into all that stuff. Tony Mulvey, and Freightonomics, for those of you that may be first-time listeners. This is the show where we discuss supply chain data as well as mix it with that economic information. So a lot of macroeconomics, but we make it relatable. And certainly we don't operate on a lag.
Yeah, definitely not on a lag. So first, though, Zach, we'll start with your marketing too. But first, we got to thank our sponsor, Netrodyne. So remove the guesswork from driver management and fleet safety and start predicting your accident reduction cost savings. Netrodyne's AI-enabled video safety platform corrects unsafe driving habits, recognizing and reinforcing great driving. With the Green Zone score, your fleet of engaged drivers will protect your bottom line. Every 50 points earned is a 14% cut to your accident rate. And Zach, I've noticed two stories this week talking about nuclear verdicts.
Yeah.
Interesting enough, from a trailer manufacturer,
I know,
and truck manufacturer Daimler hit with it too, which seems like a bad precedent to set.
You can talk about tort reform and all that all you want, which probably should happen at some level, but it's reality that we are presented in. And the top of mind for me is the Werner case. Like, everybody in the industry, shipper, carrier, broker, has to follow that story because if that does land, that could have dramatic impacts on the space. But in the meantime, go get you some Netrodyne. And I like their positive reinforcement that they really focus on there for drivers.
Absolutely. So Zach, we'll get your marketing two here started in 3, 2, 1.
Man, I wouldn't start off with anything else but the outbound tender rejection index. The higher this index goes, the tighter the market. We are still in a very loose market. We are sub 5%. We're hovering. We're trending down below that 2019 trend line that you see there in orange. We tapped on last year's tender rejection rate. Labor Day was a lot of nothing in terms of a disruptive event. It almost appeared like all the carriers were in the places they wanted to be. They were ready to go. So not a lot of disruption from Labor Day. Francine, like we talked about, didn't really do anything as of yet this week. A slight little uptick there that we might apply to that somewhat, but I don't think so. Let's go to the next chart. Talk about demand. This is the story for me, is the demand side. OTVI measures the total number of tenders in an index form going from shipper to carrier. And you see this big spike. The market is literally blowing up with demand coming out of the Labor Day holiday. And of course, a lot of these tenders could have happened over the last 7 days because this is a 7-day moving average. That is why you see that troughing each time around the holiday periods. But coming out of a holiday hot, and it just did not influence capacity. Let's look at the next map, if you will, and look at OTMS over the last 2 weeks. So increasing tender market share value. I like to look at market share because it kind of ignores the absolute value of the volume itself. So small markets get represented appropriately is the way that I would like to say it. So looking at the dark blues, we see some increasing volumes, significant increasing volumes out of Twin Falls, Ontario, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Indianapolis. I want to focus on a few of those to close this loop here, though. Let's go to the chart. Looking at Ontario and the tender rejections out of Ontario, volume spiking out of Ontario. This is a lot of that warehouse, Inland Empire. Rejection rates, however, not so much.
Yeah, it truly feels like, well, I mean, it's just a signal. Ontario is where the freight is, but there's a lot of carriers out there willing to move under contract.
Totally different environment from what we saw this summer, where it's almost like the demand caught the carriers off guard in the summer. We talked about this a few weeks in a row now, how Ontario really, it's the largest freight market in the United States from an outbound perspective. But that's where that Inland Empire is. A lot of the imports come into Los Angeles. They get transitioned into these warehousing districts out there, gross majority of them, a lot of them retail. And then they transition across the country. A lot of that freight demand that was still moving off that import volume, because import volume has not subsided.
Yeah.
It has three choices once it gets into the country. And of course, Los Angeles, Long Beach, the single largest import or port complex in the United States, represents about 35% of all imports, containerized. And it has three options: warehouse, stay on the rail, get on the rail in the container, or get on a truck.
Yeah.
And we've seen the intermodal demand really ramp up here over the last couple of months. Truckload lost some share there in August, but obviously now it looks like it may be coming back.
Yeah, I mean, I think timing of it has something to do with it. I mean, it's a little early for what you would see demand like a spike like this, but I think one of the things that I think it's just a part of a reaction is, I mean, with the ILA and the potentials there, if you're having to reroute freight to the West Coast, well, you've got to free up some of that space that you've been moving freight into, right?
Got to move eventually.
It's got to. So I think it I don't know how much of it is that, but I think it sets this. It could be a possibility of why you're seeing this is they're moving freight that had already come through the West Coast and moving it more inland in preparation for this freight that's either getting rerouted from East Coast ports to the West Coast or the increased demand that we're seeing from overseas to the West Coast. Like if you look at IOTI.US LAX, so look at that inbound ocean TEUs on the day of departure, basically. Right. I mean, it's still up near record levels. Like it hasn't, like you said, it hasn't subsided. It eventually you fill up the space on the West Coast and it's got to move. Like if that's where you're moving freight from,
I'm just
going
to
continue to move down the supply chain.
Yeah, and I'm just shocked that we saw the large outflow, and it's not obviously all in Ontario. Yeah, that's just one of the largest markets in the United States, so I decided to focus on it. But I am shocked about the lack of response and rejection rates. I made a meme. You know, for those of you that have listened to this show before, well, yeah, there we go, Memeonomics. I love memes. When I saw this chart of tender volumes versus tender rejections out of Los Angeles, volumes are up 13% over the last 2 weeks, mind you, because I ignored the holiday trough. So that's a significant, you can tell this is a significant thing. Rejection rates all the way down, barely even a hiccup here. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
My favorite, it's not Newman, but the actor that played Newman, Wayne, I can't remember his name. Seinfeld. Sorry, Seinfeld reference. But that's a Jurassic Park meme.
I knew that part.
Yeah.
but I mean, it is interesting that like it seemed like it didn't, like you said, the demand spike you saw early in June, right? It did catch people off guard. Look at where rejection rates went to. I mean, what, 7%? I mean, upwards of 8%. This increased demand, and I don't know if it's people have started following what's going on at the ports and things like that, where you're seeing that increased demand that carriers are now flooding back out there. Yeah. But I think it is interesting that, I mean, this is arguably the largest spike we've had this year in demand, and no reaction is
right.
I don't know if it's alarming, but I think it
figured it out.
Yeah, they just understand.
In June, carriers aren't watching Los Angeles as much. Like it's really, produce moves and things like that. That's probably a dynamic that's changing a little bit since COVID, but it's September and October where Los Angeles really has its big moment, because that's when all that retail freight comes to the megalopolis and the centers on the east. But Before we get to the ILA stuff, I want to, of course, hit on CPI.
Yeah.
Real quick.
I think
in
that's
economic
the big
discussion.
one.
That's the big one because CPI, as you know, the Consumer Price Index, that is a measure of inflation. It's not the Fed's favorite measure of inflation, but it is a measure. And let's go.
Yeah. So increased 0.2% in August. So really not kind of matched July's increase on the month-over-month increases. So prices still going up, just at a slower rate than what they were earlier in the year. It's a positive sign overall, kind of matching that 0.2% monthly increase, kind of where you want to be. I mean, if you're talking, you want inflation long, it's a little higher than you want, but you can have months of 0.2. I mean, if you start having multiple months in a row, that's where it becomes concerning. I think the difference here is that's the headline number.
Yeah.
It's the core number that is the challenge. When you look at the 12-month total for the CPI, came in at 2.5, so lowest it's been.
Yeah, and core excludes food and energy.
Food and energy because they're quite volatile.
Yeah.
So 2.5, it was like 2.8, so pretty big drop month over. Or if you look at the 12-month total in July and 12-month total in August, like it's a pretty significant like downward move. Core inflation, so excluding energy and food prices, was flat at 3.2%. So it's a sign that energy prices are really, or food prices, in this case, energy prices were the big driver of that downward move.
Right. So core is at 3.2. And then the
headlines at 2.5. Yeah. And if you look at it, I mean, energy prices as a whole down 4% year over year. It's even more significant when you break it down to like gasoline down 10.3%. So that's where you're seeing that drastic downward move.
Both those figures, though, feel like the Fed rate cut.
It's not going to be. Yeah. Yes, it does. We've moved to where we're at is a level that the Fed should start changing policy. You look at the labor market, and we didn't really touch a whole lot on it. I mean, you had the jobs report last week. Kind of underwhelming again. I mean, I think
we all know that data point at this point is overstating the health of the labor market.
Yeah, it clearly the labor market is slowed.
Yeah.
The rate cut is basically baked in. Everybody's expecting it. I think what that reading did though was take a 50 basis point cut off the table for this month. I think what we're looking at is 25 basis points, and we'll find out by the time we talk next week. We'll know what the Fed's decision ultimately is. But I think when you look at it, inflation's still trending lower as a whole, which is what they were looking for, even though the core number flattened out for a month. It's not the end of the world. When this time last year we were at 4.3%. So 4.3 to 3.2, we're headed in that right direction.
Yeah, I think we know that the ability for companies to pass along rate increases has diminished significantly over the last year. All right, so let's get into this ILA thing, the international longshoremen. So for those of you that don't know, which some may not, it is a pending strike of the workers that are involved in the ports around the East Coast, all the way, all up and down the North American East Coast, all the way down to Houston and the Gulf Coast as well. So I asked ChatGPT, I said, do I need to worry about the ILA strike as a shipper? And of course, its response was, yes, you do. And basically, it tells you that it could lead to increasing shipping times, raising costs. You've got bottlenecks going on potentially. Rate increases could also happen and shipping routes being disrupted. This is all kind of common sense to me. Like, I don't know that I learned anything from ChatGPT today. So, yes, I think that was a very softball question for ChatGPT. Sure, but it doesn't tell me like the magnitude. But first, I want to ask, same question, but as a carrier or a logistics service provider, and I'm kind of grouping brokers in here in the middle. I know a lot of our audience is brokerage. But yes, as a carrier, you should be concerned about an ILA strike because it can disrupt your operations, causing delays, unloading and loading goods, reducing the availability of loads, increasing wait times at ports, like all things, like a lot of inefficiency potentially from this, of course, bottlenecking of stuff around the ports. Any kind of disruption in a carrier network is a problem.
Yeah, because they're almost designed to run fairly, I don't want to say lean, but it is lean to an extent, right? They're supposed to be efficient. And when you throw a disruption in there, like you start it has knock-on effects, right? Like if you miss a pickup, well, then you miss these the window times of when you have pickups and deliveries, like it extends out, it gets delayed. And I talked with Rob Haddock in a shipper of choice webinar. So talking about that from a shipper perspective, like having flexibility in these things, like that's going to be a key when these disruptions happen, because your network or your business may not be affected, but your carrier who is dealing with some of these disruptions may have delays and things like that.
And you're actually making my next point, which is I like the carrier answer way better.
Yes.
Because that's why the shipper should care.
Yeah.
Like I learned something out of the carrier response, because it's like, well, why does the shipper care in general? It's like, some problems might occur with my shipping. What are those problems, and what is the impact of those problems in general? And that gives me the carrier answer gives me more of a sense of magnitude and where things can go wrong for you.
Yeah, because again, you may not feel it.
Yeah.
But
in general, yes.
But something could happen to your carrier base that you will then in turn feel it, and it can be significant. I mean, we'll see what happens.
Well, let's get into the weeds of it. We've got a couple of stories out there. FreightWaves.com, of course, always ready. Potential port strike has retailers and manufacturers scrambling. Due to expire at midnight on September 30th, the contract covers 25,000 workers in ports stretching from Boston to Houston, for those of you that are interested in the coverage there. So all those ports in that line are impacted. Many retailers, in quotes here, have taken steps to mitigate the potential impact by bringing in products earlier and front-loading the peak shipping season, or by shifting product back to the West Coast. Jonathan Gold of the NRF, VP of Supply Chain and Customs, is quoted as saying that. So, the takeaway here is that they have already done it.
Yeah.
Like they're doing it right now in preparation. So like if they're doing it now, and you saw my chart earlier coming out of Los Angeles, from a truckload management standpoint, they're okay.
Yeah.
Like right now.
It's when it actually happens. I think what you're seeing now is a little bit of proactiveness that I think that's what changed in COVID to some degree, because it seemed really reactive, and now they're a little more proactive. And I think part of that is because of where the market conditions are right now. They've been so soft for so long, like they've had the ability. Finding capacity, it largely has been easy.
Yeah.
And the luxury of this is it's not like a black swan event. I mean, we're talking about it, 3 weeks in advance. It's really been kind of talked about for upwards of 6 weeks.
A known event.
Yeah, it's not like a hurricane that pops up in a week and gives you really short, like you've had months to kind of prepare, go through your contingencies and the like. So
that's the retail side. That's our NRF, National Retail Federation. The next statement comes from Christopher Nettram, and managing vice president of policy here from NAM. And he told CNBC this would deal an immediate blow to the manufacturing supply chain. So more just-in-time centric manufacturing processes that don't necessarily have large inventories. If they have some sort of disruption, even a day is impactful to the manufacturing supply chain.
Yeah. I mean, if you looked at, the UAW strike last year, right? If you look at industrial production, like of auto vehicles, like it had like a lasting impact.
Yeah.
It was basically 2 months before you saw kind of a recovery to where it was before the strike. I mean, while it's not it maybe gets things back up a little faster, but like one day you talk about some of these automotive manufacturing plants and facilities, like they're running on like 4 hours of inventory at any given moment. Like if you miss a delivery, like you can shut a plant down very quickly. And this could have this is where those knock-on effects
Yeah.
really come in, because it's like, okay, we missed something, but now the whole plant shut down.
Right.
How long does it take to get that ramp back up and moving kind of in a way that it is in quote normal, like a normal period? So I think it's hard to quantify it, but I think it's what you're going to see is like, it is the knock-on effect.
Yeah,
versus
but anybody involved in manufacturing just in time type of processes obviously has the outweighed impact here.
Yeah, but I'll put this question on you and your thoughts, because we talked to Dr. Zach Rogers last week about the LMI, and the upstream firms are building inventories. Do you think they're building inventories to mitigate some of this risk?
I would have to assume yes, but
because it really only happened in the last couple months.
Yeah, but the ability for these type of companies to flex up in their storage is limited.
Yes.
Like the retailers have lots of warehousing in general. They have multiple warehouses. They have different types of warehouses.
They have 100,000 square foot stores.
They have staging facilities for different products and SKUs upstream and wholesalers, and that is included in that number as well. Yeah. The downstream stuff that Dr. Rogers talks about, the fulfillment centers, the parts, the end production parts facilities for the manufacturing supply chain are all much smaller and are designed to be flexible and fast. So that's the group that is probably going to be at most risk, is if they just don't have the capability of storing a lot of upstream stuff right now, because that's where things are going to impact. But that's not to say that it will have a huge impact. So the next story that I think is very intriguing comes from Stuart Charles. Could East Coast port strike spread to West Coast? Now, this would be an event. Yes. Now, I want to preface this by saying that I don't know that this is something that people necessarily need to be super concerned about, in my opinion, but it is something to think about and consider, because the ILWU, which handles the West Coast port complexes, has come out and voiced overwhelming support, as they will and should, as two of the same type of entities with coinciding interests. Basically came out and said, as you continue negotiating and move close to the expiration of your contract, the ILWU stands in solidarity with the ILA for a fair contract that respects dock workers and protects our jurisdiction. So basically, they're very concerned about automation around the ports, people losing jobs, et cetera. And that's not news. And they're going to say this, but they just ratified a contract last year.
Yeah.
And I don't know that there's any more than just an announcement.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the more interesting part as this plays out, is like what does come of the ILWU? Like, are they not going to be willing to, unload containers from the ships that were going to go through East and Gulf Coast ports? Like, they just refuse to do it. Like, that's going to be the question to me, and how this plays out, because if that happens, now you're really talking about potential bottlenecks and the like, and delays.
Yeah, but they're not. They technically can't.
They can't.
Do anything.
I mean, yeah.
And actually, so there was a quote in here from an attorney specializing in customs and trade, Susan Conross. Hopefully, I got that right. Said, since there's an existing contract on the West Coast, there could perhaps be a one-day stoppage, but there are no grounds based on the ILA situation on which the ILWU members can strike. So that removes the threat of a strike on the West Coast altogether. So if they were to do so, I would expect the carriers would get an injunction forcing the longshore workers to go back to work post-haste.
Yeah.
So the West Coast, not really a thing for this situation. They have to speak out. And then probably one of the more interesting little extra comments here, workers went on strike in 2012, and a lot of people were on their side until the amount of the wages was published.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like, keeping in mind there's context.
Yeah. I think in the ILA one, for its last I thought I saw was somewhere in the upwards of 70% increases over the course of 5 years. Like, those are big wage increases.
And maybe some of them are garnered. If the bottom number is small, 70% isn't as big. Be careful with percentages, but be informed before you just blindly go and accept that this something is deserved versus not.
The other side of this is going to be, even though you have a pro-labor
Yeah.
administration right now, like odds are the risk to there's going to be some government step in
Yeah.
if this looks like it's going to drag on to any potential like long-term issue.
Right. So let's turn our attention to things that probably aren't going to happen, to something that we can actually monitor and look at. So Mike Bowden-Distel, of course, writes shippers' wariness of potential strike visible in sonar data. And he goes on to cite several data points inside of sonar. For those of you that don't have sonar and are interested in looking at data that you don't have access to, I highly recommend this article. Of course, first thing he pulls up here, the IOTI chart for the Port of Los Angeles versus the United States. We are seeing an outweighed amount of growth versus the national average into the Port of Los Angeles specifically. This removes, of course, Long Beach just to make it easier to look at, but there are more goods coming into the Port of Los Angeles, Long Beach than the rest of the country in terms of growth percentage.
Which is interesting because you would think it's already so big that you would see growth in other areas opposed from this like you would see outweighed growth in smaller markets.
He talks about how this is not just an ILA strike growth number. He talks about it being, basically the Red Sea attacks, the labor issues in Canada, both on the rails and at the ports, low water levels at Panama. That one's kind of going away. And of course, the pull forward of tariff increases as well. So there's a lot going on here. This isn't necessarily saying, hey, this is the ILA in general all the way, but it is probably a factor.
But I mean, it still is interesting to me that you've seen, again, largest port in the country grow at a rate well in excess of what
they've handled it. They've handled
no real issue, like no issues.
All the issues have come from like China.
Yeah.
Their port situation isn't great. And the Port of Los Angeles, Long Beach, the intermodal container transfers have been efficient and still running. And, and that's the next thing, intermodal growth. If we look at the chart for total outbound loaded container volume out of Los Angeles, it looks like the maritime chart, essentially, like huge growth here, loaded both international and domestic container growth here, really outpacing the market.
I think what's interesting, you look at this, and if you listen to JB Hunt's earnings call from the second quarter, which was early August, mid-August,
right?
I guess maybe even July, they were talking about how they were seeing double-digit growth. They didn't really go into too much depth how much growth they've seen in out of the West Coast, but double-digit growth that had continued into the third quarter. You look at that, and like that number's like exploded in terms of year-over-year growth in recent weeks and months. I mean, if you pull that chart up, I mean, look at the gap between. I mean, we're at record levels, but and COVID. I mean, it really didn't start until August.
Yeah.
I mean, July it was high, especially at the back half.
Well, this is the mechanism that wasn't present in June.
Yeah.
That has now taken a lot of that slack.
But you go and I don't remember if you included it in the story, but if you go look at like intermodal spot rates out of LA, they ticked up slightly, but they haven't moved significantly, which tells me they're able to handle any increase in demand.
Handling this. This is not having a big, like everybody looks at demand side indicators like they are the end all be all of, the market analytics. And the truth is that demand is just one part of the supply demand equation.
I was going to say, it's a two-sided market, right? We've got too much capacity and demand has grown. And that's...
So I want to pull up two more charts here real quick. OTVI, Los Angeles, and EWR. So the West Coast hub and the East Coast hub. Los Angeles showing, pretty decent amount of growth. It's the blue line there on top versus the East Coast guys on the New York, New Jersey, 6% growth. Not significant. Los Angeles outpacing, but it's still important to note there's growth on the East Coast.
Yeah, and I think that's what was kind of interesting to me was you've seen growth on the East Coast. It's just not near, and maybe this is why you haven't seen it. Didn't catch people off guard like it did maybe on the West Coast in the summer months, where you saw rejection rates on the West Coast kind of pop up to 7-8%, and you didn't see that happen in the Northeast. Typically doesn't happen in the Northeast, but I think the growth factor, maybe not more stable long term, like what you would expect to see growth versus, this sudden surge.
Well, last but not least, the spot rates, Los Angeles to Chicago, the big thoroughfare coming off the West Coast. They're not doing anything.
Yeah.
I look at Los Angeles to Dallas, Chicago, Seattle pretty regularly, all of them showing some level of downward pressure. So takeaways here for me, there's nothing to see here yet. Like, I don't see anything manifesting now. I think if the, strike does occur,
Yeah.
that may change things a little bit.
Yeah. I think
for a certain sector.
there's chances, but we'll see what plays out. I mean, we've got a few weeks before it really.
There's always the I don't know what I don't know, but right now, it looks
to say.
okay. Yeah.